Today, we descend into the most shocking Everest deaths ever recorded. From falling through collapsing cornices and mismanaged oxygen systems, to being buried in avalanches or swept off exposed ridges, these climbers made choices that proved instantly fatal. It was April 29th, 2015, and the Khumbu icefall on Mount Everest stretched from base camp to Camp 1, a shifting maze of crevasses, seracs, and unstable ice towers. Aluminum ladders bridged deep gaps, and thin snow and ice created hidden hazards. Every step demanded careful crampon placement, as even minor slips could be fatal. Dr. James Thornfield, 48, was a former emergency medicine physician turned pharmaceutical entrepreneur, founder of a $312 million company specializing in emergency medications. He had spent years managing life or death situations and developing drugs for trauma patients, but his climbing experience was limited to Denali and Aconcagua. Despite this, he approached Everest methodically, hiring experienced Sherpas, investing in premium gear, and following a conservative acclimatization schedule, though time away from his company had compressed his timeline. Thornfield began his ascent through the icefall in pre-dawn light, following standard protocols set by the icefall doctors, who maintain ladders and mark the route. His guide maintained a position behind him, ready to intervene if necessary. Conditions were favorable: clear skies, light winds, and excellent visibility. Thornfield moved steadily, carefully testing each step and crampon placement. Radio checks confirmed his pace matched the planned timeline. As he approached a narrow technical section, a slow-moving group of climbers blocked the standard route. Rather than wait, Thornfield opted for a slight detour around the congestion. This decision moved him about 30 feet off the established path onto unmarked terrain. Subtle signs of instability, faint fissures, sagging snow, and uneven surfaces hinted at potential hazards, but were difficult to detect without extensive icefall experience. He advanced cautiously, probing the snow with his ice axe and shifting his weight deliberately from crampon to crampon. Beneath the surface, repeated thermal cycles had hollowed the ice and snow, leaving critical support structures fragile and deceptive. As he approached a snow bridge spanning a wide crevasse, he paused to tighten straps on his pack and adjust his harness, unaware that subtle cracks had begun to propagate across the surface. Silent warnings, easily missed in the monotony of the icefall. The snow bridge failed without warning under the combined weight of his body and equipment. He plummeted roughly 147 feet into the yawning crevasse. During the descent, he struck protruding ice ledges twice, suffering catastrophic spinal compression fractures, severe head trauma, and extensive internal injuries. The impact created forces far beyond what the human body can withstand, instantly rendering him incapacitated and unable to attempt self-rescue. The crevasse's sheer walls rose more than 140 feet above him, forming a vertical ice chamber with no viable exit. His headlamp remained operational, casting light on the icy walls but offering no path to escape. Radio transmissions continued intermittently, but the signal was weak and distorted, reaching base camp only in broken fragments, making immediate rescue impossible. Snow and ice debris accumulated around him in the aftermath of the collapse, further isolating him and sealing the fatal outcome. Hypothermia set in immediately due to contact with ice surface. Spinal injuries and internal bleeding caused rapid physiological decline. Rescue was attempted as soon as radio contact failed, but the technical challenge of navigating unstable ice delayed access. A specialized team reached the site nearly 3 hours later, confirming that Thornfield had already succumbed to the combination of trauma and cold. Body recovery took additional hours due to the extreme terrain. Coroner analysis determined the cause of death as massive internal trauma, with severe hypothermia and acute mountain sickness as contributing factors. Equipment was found fully functional. The accident resulted from terrain hazards and the fatal consequences of deviating from the marked route. Media coverage focused on Thornfield's achievements in emergency medicine and pharmaceuticals rather than mountaineering. The climbing community classified the incident as a terrain hazard fatality, emphasizing the Khumbu icefall's unpredictable nature. The irony of a man who had spent his career saving trauma victims dying from trauma himself underscored the mountain's impartial danger. It was April 28, 2016. Weather forecasts showed promising patterns for mid-May summit attempts on Mount Everest. Expedition teams were pushing through acclimatization rotations. Claudia Kensington was 48, a pharmaceutical sales director from Boston who managed a large team. She was known for demanding management and refusing excuses. She'd hired an expensive expedition company for premium service. From the beginning, she treated guides and staff as service employees rather than expert advisors. The trek to base camp showed Everest wouldn't respond to her usual approach. She struggled with altitude, arriving with a persistent headache and shortness of breath lasting 3 days. The expedition doctor recommended extra rest. Claudia refused, stating she had business obligations in 6 weeks. She brought a satellite phone and spent hours daily on conference calls from 17,600 feet. During the first acclimatization rotation, Claudia's oxygen saturation levels were consistently lower than others. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, her saturation was 65%, while others registered 70 to 75%. The guide recommended a slower schedule. She dismissed the concern, stating she'd completed the rotation and felt fine. The second rotation began April 28th. The plan was to climb to Camp 2, spend one night, continue to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet briefly, then descend. Claudia reached Camp 2 with oxygen saturation at 64%. She complained of headache and nausea. The doctor noted her breathing seemed labored, but lungs sounded clear. That evening, Claudia spent 2 hours on a conference call, her raised voice audible to others. She appeared agitated and had difficulty sleeping. The next morning, she reported poor sleep and headache, but insisted she was ready. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 ascends the Lhotse face at 45 degrees or steeper, taking 4 to 6 hours. Claudia struggled from the beginning. Her pace was slow with frequent rest stops. She reached Camp 3 at 2 p.m. after 7 hours, exhausted and breathing heavily. Her oxygen saturation was 58%. The guide noticed her breathing seemed more labored than expected. Claudia admitted feeling extremely tired and short of breath. The guide decided to descend immediately. Claudia protested, saying she needed rest first. After discussion, she agreed. Descent began at 2:30 p.m. Within 15 minutes, Claudia was in serious trouble. Her coordination was poor and she moved extremely slowly. At approximately 23,000 feet, she began coughing. The cough was wet. Pink frothy sputum appeared on her glove. The guide recognized high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. Fluid was accumulating in Claudia's lungs. HAPE requires immediate descent and can progress to death within hours. The guide radioed an emergency call. Over the next hour, Claudia's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her coughing became more frequent with pink frothy fluid. Her breathing became increasingly labored, rapid, shallow breaths. Her lips and fingernails took on a bluish tint. Her oxygen saturation was 48%, critically low. The guide and 2 staff who'd climbed to assist essentially dragged Claudia down the Lhotse face. She could barely move. By 6 p.m., they'd only reached 22,000 feet. Claudia's consciousness was declining. She seemed confused and couldn't follow instructions. At approximately 21,500 feet, Claudia collapsed onto her hands and knees, coughing violently, bringing up large amounts of fluid. Then she slumped onto her side. The guide checked her breathing, rapid and gurgling. Her oxygen saturation was unmeasurable. He administered supplemental oxygen at maximum, 4 liters per minute. Her saturation came up to 52%, but she remained semi-conscious and unable to move. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The guide radioed for helicopter evacuation, but helicopters couldn't operate at 21,500 feet as darkness fell. The team continued dragging Claudia. By 7:30 p.m., they reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet. A helicopter attempted to reach them, but couldn't land safely. The pilot radioed he would try at first light. Claudia was placed in a tent with continuous oxygen. The doctor monitored her through the night. Her condition remained critical, semi-conscious, breathing rapidly, coughing up fluid. Her saturation remained in the low 50s despite maximum oxygen. At approximately 3 a.m. on April 30th, Claudia's breathing became more irregular. Several rapid breaths, then stopping for 10 to 15 seconds, then gasping. This pattern indicated her brain was being affected by severe oxygen deprivation. At 3:47 a.m., she stopped breathing entirely. The doctor attempted CPR, but knew it was futile at 21,000 feet. After 15 minutes, he stopped. Claudia Kensington was dead. The helicopter evacuation proceeded at dawn as body recovery. Claudia's body was flown to lower altitude, then returned to Boston. The official cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema, with contributing factors of inadequate acclimatization, continued ascent despite symptoms, and delayed descent. It was May 21, 2014, on Mount Everest's southeast ridge, just below the Hillary Step, where the route narrowed into a slanted corridor of exposed rock and fixed rope at roughly 28,700 feet. The sky was clear, the winds were manageable, and the summit behind them looked calm enough to justify the effort it had taken to reach it. But the air was thin, movement was slow, and the ridge was crowded with climbers descending on limited strength, each one relying on the same narrow line of rope and the assumption that it would continue to hold as it always had. Maribel Cruz was 41 years old and worked as a logistics manager in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For years, climbing Mount Everest had been a long-term goal she planned around carefully, but a breast cancer diagnosis put that goal on hold for nearly 5 years. Treatment, recovery, and medical clearance reshaped her timeline, forcing her to postpone the expedition she had once expected to attempt in her mid-30s. When her doctors finally cleared her for strenuous activity, she began rebuilding toward the climb with the intention of finishing what had been delayed. She returned to training immediately. She joined a local hiking group, enrolled in formal mountaineering courses, and spent the next 18 months gaining experience step by step rather than chasing speed. Her preparation included winter ascents in Colorado, guided glacier travel in Alaska, and multiple high-altitude trips designed to test acclimatization and endurance. She was not sponsored and had no public following. The expedition was funded through personal savings, overtime work, and contributions from a small circle of friends. She planned her summit attempt to coincide with her birthday, intending the climb to mark both the milestone and what she described to others as a second chance at life. On the mountain, she wore a single patch from a cancer support organization where she volunteered, helping patients coordinate transportation, meals, and treatment schedules. Her approach to climbing reflected her professional background. She labeled oxygen bottles, carried a spare regulator taped to her pack, and kept handwritten checklists on waterproof paper covering hydration, mask seals, carabiner gates, and glove use. Guides noted during acclimatization rotations that her movement was deliberate and slower than average, especially above Camp 3. At higher altitude, she became more conservative during transitions and technical sections, maintaining steady forward progress, but pausing longer than others when clipping in, adjusting equipment, or stepping through uneven terrain. That approach minimized small mistakes, but increased the amount of time she spent in exposed sections of the route above 28,000 feet. The South Col route above Camp 4 is a managed corridor rather than a wilderness wander. Fixed ropes are installed early and maintained by a mix of guides and high-altitude workers. Those ropes are anchored into snow and ice with pickets and screws, and into rock where the route crosses exposed stone. Climbers clip in with ascenders or carabiners and move like traffic on a rail. The system prevents small slips from becoming long falls, but it is not designed to absorb big shock loads. The most dangerous part is not the rope itself, it is what the rope touches. When a loaded line runs over a sharp edge, it can cut like a tool. Teams try to pad those edges, but padding can shift, get buried, blow away, or be removed by the constant sawing motion of climbers passing through. The summit push began late on May 20th at the South Col, a wide saddle of wind-scoured snow at roughly 26,000 feet. Headlamps flicked on across the camp in uneven clusters as teams prepared to leave, each group operating on slightly different timelines depending on oxygen supply, guide availability, and confidence in the weather window. The air was cold and dry, with temperatures low enough to harden surface snow, but not cold enough to lock the mountain completely in place. Wind forecasts showed a brief lull, and that was enough for most operators to commit. Movement out of Camp 4 was slow from the start. Climbers clipped into the fixed rope almost immediately, forming a staggered line that stretched upward toward the triangular face. Regulators hissed steadily as oxygen flowed, each breath pulling from bottles that had been calculated to last only so long at altitude. Standing still burned oxygen at nearly the same rate as moving, and delays early in the climb shortened the margin later on. As the line climbed higher, small interruptions began stacking up. One climber ahead stopped to tighten a loose crampon strap. Another leaned against the rope to catch their breath, forcing those behind to wait on the slope. A guide paused to check an anchor that had shifted slightly under load, calling for a brief hold while he reset it. None of these stops lasted long, but together they slowed the entire column. Climbers stood angled into the mountain, boots edging on hard snow, muscles tightening as blood flow decreased in the cold. Maribel moved with the same deliberate pace she had shown during earlier rotations. She stayed clipped in, advanced her ascender in short intervals, and avoided overtaking unless directed by a guide. Frost formed and reformed around mask valves throughout the climb, requiring occasional adjustments that added seconds at each stop. By the time the group reached the upper slopes below the south summit, congestion had become visible. Some climbers sat briefly on their packs while waiting for movement to resume, a risky practice at that altitude, but one that had become common during crowded summit pushes. Others remained standing, leaning into their harnesses and the rope, letting the system take some of their weight. Low snow conditions that season had changed the route in subtle ways. Rock that was normally buried was exposed, forcing climbers to place feet more carefully and reducing the number of usable stances. Guides were aware of these changes, but rerouting at that altitude was limited by time, manpower, and the pressure to move clients through the window. As dawn approached, the line slowed again near the south summit. Climbers transitioning from ascent to descent crossed paths with those still going up. Each delay pushed the descent later into the day, when fatigue would be higher and traffic heavier. Maribel reached the summit shortly after sunrise. The summit area was already crowded when Maribel arrived. Climbers stood clipped into the fixed line, waiting for space to step forward. There was little room to move freely. The summit itself offered only a narrow standing area, and climbers cycled through quickly, aware that staying too long increased congestion for everyone behind them. Another climber took a photograph for Maribel as she stood near the rope, her gloves still on, oxygen mask secured. She held a small piece of paper she had carried in a chest pocket throughout the climb. The words "still here" were written in thick marker. The photo took only a few seconds. She folded the paper back down, checked her mask seal, and clipped back into the line without sitting. Around her, other climbers were finishing their summit stops. Some raised flags or posed for longer videos. Guides urged people to move on, pointing down the route and tapping their watches. The descent began immediately below the summit, with climbers reversing direction along the same fixed ropes. As descending climbers met those still pushing upward toward the top, the route narrowed as it approached the Hillary step, and spacing became difficult to maintain. Several climbers stopped just below the summit. Maribel moved into the descent line without hesitation. She maintained the same careful rhythm she had used on the ascent. Her pace was slower than some, faster than others, but the route did not allow overtaking. When climbers ahead paused, she paused with them, standing angled into the slope while the rope supported part of her weight. Guides called for brief holds while managing opposing traffic. Each stop lasted seconds or minutes. By the time Maribel reached the area just above the Hillary step, the sun was fully up. The snow surface softened slightly, and wind gusts funneled through the ridge. The route below narrowed further, forcing climbers to cluster near anchor points. Two fixed ropes ran close together through this section, and in the glare and thin air, the line bowed slightly under the combined load of multiple climbers, a normal sight on busy summit days. Maribel continued downward toward the bottleneck below the Hillary step, clipped into the same fixed line as the climbers around her, moving into a section where spacing tightened and the margin for error narrowed. The fixed ropes ran through this section in short, closely spaced segments, anchored to a mix of ice and exposed rock. With traffic coming from both directions, guides were forced to manage flow one climber at a time. Several people ahead of Maribel stopped to rest while clipped in. A climber ascending from below struggled to step up onto the platform, while another climber above held position, clipped into the same rope. Carabiners clicked against rock as climbers shifted position. Wind gusts pushed across the ridge, knocking balance off just enough to make every step deliberate. Maribel stood angled into the slope, one boot lower than the other, maintaining 3 points of contact while she waited for movement ahead. The rope in front of her ran upward toward the Hillary step, disappearing behind a rock bulge. Several small slips occurred in the minutes before the line began moving again. One climber lost footing briefly when a crampon point skated across rock before catching. Each incident sent a short, sharp tug through the line, felt by climbers above and below. No one fell. Guides called for steady movement and spacing, but the terrain limited how much space could be created. Oxygen bottle changes continued in place. Empty cylinders were unclipped and lowered, while fresh ones were hauled up, valves opened and checked before masks were reseated. During each swap, the climber changing bottles remained clipped into the fixed rope, adding weight to the system. Climbers behind waited, unable to pass. As movement resumed, the line surged forward in small increments. Climbers advanced a few feet, stopped, then advanced again. Each surge transferred load along the rope, pulling it taut and then allowing it to relax. The rope slid slightly across the rock with each movement, its position shifting by inches as it bore weight from different angles. Maribel advanced when signaled, sliding her ascender down, stepping carefully, then stopping again as the climber ahead paused. The rope remained under constant tension, carrying the weight of multiple bodies at once. The exposed rock in this section left little buffer between rope and stone. By the time the climber above her stopped to manage his oxygen system, the rope segment connecting them was already holding a steady load, stretched across the ridge and pressed against the bare rock where the padding had thinned. The climber above Maribel stopped just short of the next anchor point to manage an oxygen bottle change. He remained clipped into the fixed rope while loosening the empty cylinder from his pack and reaching for the replacement. The terrain there was uneven, with hard-packed snow thinning into exposed stone. His boots rested on mixed footing, front points biting into snow while rear points pressed against rock. As he shifted his weight to free one hand, his right crampon failed to seat fully. The front points skated across the rock for a fraction of a second before catching again. The movement was short, no more than a few feet, but it transferred force sharply into the rope. Several climbers felt the tug at once. The fixed line was already carrying steady weight from multiple climbers below and above. Instead of pulling straight down, the sudden load yanked the rope sideways. The line tightened instantly, drawn hard against the exposed limestone edge that crossed the route at an angle. Padding that had once covered the contact point had shifted several inches downslope, leaving bare rock under tension. Witnesses later described the sound as a single sharp crack, clean, brief, and out of place among the usual wind, metal clicks, and foot movement. It did not echo. It stopped abruptly. The rope did not stretch or snap in stages. Under lateral tension, the fibers were pressed tightly against the stone and failed at once. The cut was clean. The upper section recoiled toward the anchor, whipping backward as tension released. The lower section, the segment Maribel was clipped into, went slack immediately. Maribel had been leaning back slightly, using the rope to maintain balance while her crampons held the slope. When the tension vanished, her boots slid on the angled surface. Wind-packed snow gave way to loose rock dust beneath her feet. The slide accelerated faster than footing could recover. Her gloved hand moved toward the rope, but her ascender was already attached to the severed segment. The device remained locked onto the line as designed. The line itself was no longer connected above. Her body rotated backward as her feet lost purchase. Climbers above later reported seeing her knees straighten and her shoulders roll as her weight shifted away from the ridge. In the next moment, she dropped out of view over the Kangshung side. A helmet camera worn by a climber higher on the route captured the failure in unstable frames. The footage showed the rope vibrating under load, then snapping slack. A dark figure moved downward and vanished beyond the edge of the frame. The audio recorded the crack, followed by shouted warnings and sudden movement as climbers reacted. The severed rope whipped across the anchor point, striking rock before settling. The loose end flicked downward and disappeared, pulled by the weight below. Carabiners struck stone as climbers shifted to secure themselves. Guides shouted instructions, directing climbers to hold position and clip into secondary anchors. The fall itself was not fully visible from the ridge. Below that section, the southeast ridge broke into rock ribs and hard snow benches that angled sharply downward. In the helmet footage, Small clouds of snow appeared briefly below the ridge. After that, only blowing spindrift filled the frame. The rope segment attached to Maribel followed her during the initial drop. Guides later reported seeing the loose end pulled taut for a moment before vanishing, suggesting it had caught briefly on rock before being dragged free. On the ridge, the immediate priority shifted to preventing additional casualties. Guides secured the remaining rope, tied off the cut section, and redirected climbers to the secondary line. Movement stopped completely while anchors were checked and spacing re-established, exposed to wind and sun, waiting for the route to stabilize. Several people remained attached to the compromised section until they could be redirected to secondary anchors. The exposed nature of the ridge left little room to step aside. Everyone present remained where they were, secured and waiting. A Sherpa from Maribel's team moved first, clipping into a nearby anchor point before leaning outward to inspect the failure. The severed rope end was visible, the fibers cleanly cut and snapping in the wind. There was no remaining connection between the upper and lower segments. No one attempted to look further downslope. The terrain beyond the ridge dropped away steeply, out of sight. With no fixed lines and no safe way to descend from that position, a guide radioed Camp 4 at the South Col. The message was brief and factual. Fixed rope severed below the Hillary step. One climber fallen to the east, presumed fatal. Camp 4 acknowledged and requested the time, approximate location, and identifying details for the incident log. The exchange lasted less than a minute. There was no discussion of rescue. At that altitude and location, no descent into the Kangshung face was possible without placing additional climbers in immediate danger. Attention shifted to stabilizing the route. Guides tied off the remaining rope to prevent further movement, secured anchors that had been stressed by the failure, and began rerouting climbers onto the secondary line. Those still clipped into the damaged section were moved one at a time. Each transition took time. Climbers stood stationary on the slope, oxygen flowing, legs cooling as blood circulation slowed in the cold. Traffic backed up quickly. Climbers above the Hillary step were instructed to hold position until the route below was secure. Those descending were told to remain clipped in and wait for signals to move. Some climbers sat briefly on their packs while secured. The ridge remained crowded, and spacing was difficult to maintain. Maribel's teammates reached the failure point several minutes later. They saw the severed rope, the exposed limestone edge, and the anchor where the upper section had snapped back. A physician from another team who had been nearby later documented that the failure occurred too quickly for intervention, and that the sound of the rope cutting was the clearest indicator of what had happened. No additional radio traffic followed beyond updates on route status. Camp 4 recorded the incident and notified the expedition operator's liaison officer, who began assembling details for authorities. The focus remained on moving climbers down safely before fatigue and exposure created further risk. The sun climbed higher, softening surface snow and increasing the chance of slips as the day progressed. As climbers resumed movement, guides continued to manage spacing through the bottleneck, limiting the number of people attached to any single rope segment. The exposed edge where the rope had been cut was treated as a hazard zone. Climbers were directed to pass through quickly, without stopping, and to avoid pulling the rope sideways across the rock. By late morning, most of the traffic had cleared the section. The ridge quieted as climbers descended toward lower camps. No recovery attempt was made from the ridge in the days that followed. The point where Maribel fell lay far below the standard route on the Kangshung side of the mountain, where the terrain steepened into broken rock and ice without fixed lines or safe access. Any descent from the ridge into that face would have required unclipping from protection and committing to terrain where a second fall was likely. As the season progressed, snowfall gradually covered the debris field below the ridge. Ice and snow accumulated in layers, burying equipment and any remains while the upper glaciers continued their slow movement downslope, carrying embedded debris with them. Within months, nothing from the fall site was visible from above, and the area remained inaccessible from the standard route. Nearly 2 years later, in the spring of 2016, climbers traversing a lower section of the Kangshung face reported weathered gear emerging from melting ice. The items were partially embedded and showed signs of long-term exposure. indicating they had been transported downward by glacier movement rather than recently lost. Coordinates were recorded and passed through the standard liaison process, and a small team was later authorized to document the site once conditions stabilized. The focus was identification and evidence collection, not full recovery, as the terrain remained too dangerous for the retrieval of a complete body. The medical examiner concluded the cause of death was fatal trauma from a high-velocity fall. The skull showed fractures consistent with immediate loss of consciousness. The cervical spine and upper back were broken, injuries that stopped breathing and heart control instantly. The rib cage, pelvis, and long bones were extensively shattered in patterns consistent with repeated impacts against rock. Internal organs and major blood vessels were torn, damage incompatible with survival, even with immediate medical care. The technical review determined the fixed rope had been cut, not snapped, consistent with a loaded line dragged across a sharp rock edge. Witness accounts and helmet camera audio confirmed a sudden lateral load. The official report cited crowd loading and exposed limestone from low snow as contributing factors. Her waterproof climbing notebook was recovered and later used by her cancer support group to fund altitude safety training. The family declined memorial climbs, and the case was closed with route modifications recommended. It was May 22, 2016, on Mount Everest's summit pyramid above the South Col at roughly 28,000 feet. The ridge was narrow and exposed, with steep drops on all sides and cornices that could collapse without warning. Blowing snow reduced visibility to a few feet, and gusts swept across the ice and rock, making every step precarious. Enola Vasquez, 44, was the founder of a $156 million medical device company. She had spent 4 years systematically building high-altitude climbing experience, completing 6 of the 7 summits to prepare for Everest. Known for meticulous planning and calculated risk-taking, she applied the same precision to mountaineering that had made her business successful. Unlike many wealthy climbers, she preferred a minimalist strategy, carrying her own equipment and relying on Sherpa support only for route preparation and emergency backup. Her approach to Everest was deliberate. She chose the tail end of the spring climbing season, when summit crowds would be smaller, but weather conditions were slightly less predictable. Her plan emphasized self-reliance, careful pacing, and strict adherence to oxygen and hydration schedules, reflecting the same methodical mindset that had guided her business decisions. Every element of the climb, from acclimatization to route selection, had been calculated to reduce risk while maximizing her chance of a successful summit. Her summit push followed the standard late-night timeline to reach the peak by late morning. The ascent proceeded normally. She passed the balcony at 27,600 feet with a steady pace and clear radio contact. She reached the summit, spending roughly 15 minutes completing summit rituals and taking photographs before beginning her descent. By the time she reached the south summit, visibility began to drop and winds increased noticeably. A sudden shift in the jet stream brought gusts exceeding 45 miles per hour down to her elevation. On the technical terrain near the Hillary Step, a 40-foot vertical rock face, conditions became exponentially more dangerous. Snow was blowing horizontally, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet and making navigation along fixed ropes nearly impossible. Vasquez faced a critical decision: descend through the storm with limited oxygen or attempt to shelter in place. She continued descending, but a sudden gust exceeding 80 miles per hour blew her off the established route and into a small alcove formed between rock formations. The alcove, roughly 8 by 12 feet, became a wind tunnel, offering little protection against horizontal snow and violent gusts. Radio transmissions over the next 30 minutes documented her attempts to establish an emergency bivouac, but high winds destroyed her shelter and damaged equipment. Her radio then went silent, though her GPS beacon continued transmitting her position, which remained unchanged for the following 6 hours. Without shelter, Vasquez's core temperature dropped rapidly. At extreme altitude, severe hypothermia sets in quickly, shivering stops, motor skills fail, and confusion prevents further survival action. Her final hours were spent stationary, incapacitated by hypothermia and high-altitude pulmonary edema. Rescue was delayed by extreme weather. Helicopters cannot operate at this elevation in winds exceeding 70 miles per hour, and ground teams cannot navigate zero visibility conditions safely. Search teams reached her location on May 24th when conditions improved. Using her GPS beacon, they found her body in a seated position against the rock wall, partially buried by snow. Equipment scattered around the alcove confirmed the storm's severity. The official cause of death was severe hypothermia, with contributing high-altitude pulmonary edema and prolonged exposure to extreme conditions. Toxicology and equipment checks showed no failure or impairment, confirming that environmental factors alone had made survival impossible. News coverage focused largely on her business accomplishments, noting only that she had died in a climbing accident. Within the mountaineering community, her death was classified as a weather-related fatality, one of the most common causes of death on Everest. Even meticulous planning and extensive experience could not overcome the violent storm that struck that day. It was April 28, 2017. On Everest's south route at the Hillary Step, climbers faced extreme conditions and heavy congestion. More than 40 people were stacked in single-file sections of the death zone, with freezing temperatures, strong winds, and limited oxygen. The narrow ridge left little room for error, and even small delays could become life-threatening. Marcus Fieldstone, 38, was a managing partner at a major investment firm who had publicly stated his goal of achieving a fast summit time for what he called a businessman record. His climbing experience was limited to indoor rock gym training, with no prior high-altitude experience. Although he had hired a professional guide service, he frequently disregarded safety protocols. Fieldstone's confidence and reliance on resources, rather than skill, reflected a common risk factor on Everest. Minimal experience, paired with the assumption that equipment could compensate for inexperience. He had chosen to climb during peak season, when congestion on the South Col route was highest. Guides had briefed all clients on queue protocols, safety delays, and the risks of extended death zone exposure. Despite warnings and a narrow summit window, Fieldstone arrived at the Hillary Step behind schedule and began pushing past other climbers on narrow sections, placing fixed ropes and oxygen lines at risk. At approximately 28,750 feet, Fieldstone attempted to pass a slower climber on a narrow ridge segment. In doing so, he unclipped from his safety rope without warning. The other climber's equipment caught his main oxygen line, severing the regulator. His backup regulator subsequently malfunctioned due to cold exposure, cutting off his supplemental oxygen supply entirely at high altitude. Without oxygen in the death zone, hypoxia developed rapidly, impairing judgment, coordination, and physical strength. Fieldstone lost the ability to maintain balance and was unable to respond effectively to the unstable terrain. Loose ice and small rock fragments were dislodged during the slip, striking the slope and contributing to additional impacts. The uneven and unstable surface increased the force of each collision, while wind and spin drift snow-reduced traction, compounding injuries and making any attempt to regain balance extremely difficult. The initial impact of the fall caused fractures to both legs and severe cranial trauma as he struck rock outcroppings along the ridge. Momentum carried him further down the slope, and successive impacts resulted in spinal fractures and extensive soft tissue injuries. Drag marks in the snow indicated that he attempted to crawl or adjust his position after the fall, suggesting he remained conscious for a brief period despite the severity of his injuries. The combination of massive blood loss, hypoxia, exhaustion, and sub-zero temperatures rapidly overwhelmed him, leading to unconsciousness and death. Nearby climbers were unable to assist effectively due to extreme exposure and narrow terrain, and any immediate rescue was rendered impossible by the slope and congestion. Local guides and expedition teams documented the incident and relayed information to base camp. Helicopter evacuation was not feasible due to altitude, terrain, and weather, and ground teams required several hours to reach Fieldstone safely. He was pronounced deceased on site from hypoxia, compounded by altitude exposure and minor fall injuries. Recovery was further complicated by congestion and difficult terrain, requiring careful coordination to prevent additional accidents. The incident highlighted the dangers of crowding and inexperience on Everest. Extended exposure in the death zone, combined with unsafe behaviors like bypassing established protocols greatly increases risk. Oxygen failure, limited rescue options, and delayed response leave little room for error. Fieldstone's attempt underscores the importance of preparation, adherence to guide instructions, and respect for route safety. Even minor lapses in judgment or lack of high-altitude experience can have fatal consequences, showing that equipment and financial resources cannot replace proper training and decision-making. It was April 18, 2013. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was just beginning. The Khumbu icefall had been equipped with fixed ropes and aluminum ladders. For climbers, the icefall represented the first major hazard, where avalanches, collapsing ice towers, and hidden crevasses could kill without warning. Bethany Prescott was 44 from Greenwich, Connecticut. She belonged to an exclusive country club where competition was constant. The previous year, a woman from her social circle had climbed Everest and given a presentation at the club. Bethany decided she would climb Everest as well, hiring a less expensive expedition company. She'd done minimal physical training, reasoning that she attended Pilates 3 times per week. She told friends she wanted to give her own presentation at the club the following year. During the trek to base camp, Bethany complained constantly. At base camp, her lack of preparation became obvious. Altitude affected her more severely than other clients. She spent 3 days with a severe headache and nausea. The expedition doctor recommended an extra acclimatization day. Bethany refused, stating she was on a schedule. The first acclimatization rotation was scheduled for April 18th. Climb through the Khumbu icefall to Camp 1 at 19,500 feet. Spend 1 night, then descend. The Khumbu icefall is a river of ice, moving several feet per day. This movement causes ice to fracture constantly, creating ice blocks the size of houses, deep crevasses, and unstable towers called Seracs that can collapse without warning. Climbers cross using fixed ropes and ladders, typically starting around 2 or 3 a.m. when ice is most stable. As the sun warms the icefall becomes progressively more dangerous. By mid-morning, collapse risk increases dramatically. Experienced climbers aim to be through by 8 or 9 a.m. The expedition leader briefed the team the evening before. They would wake at 1:30 a.m. and begin climbing at 2:30 a.m. Bethany objected immediately, stating 1:30 a.m. was unreasonable. The leader explained this was standard protocol and non-negotiable. After 20 minutes, Bethany reluctantly agreed. At 1:30 a.m. on April 18th, the team began waking. Bethany had not gotten up. At 2 a.m., the leader found her still in her sleeping bag. The leader explained the group stayed together for safety. Bethany argued she would climb on her own schedule. The leader compromised. Bethany could depart at 4 a.m. with an assistant guide. The main group departed at 2:30 a.m. and reached Camp 1 by 7 a.m. Bethany and her assistant departed at 4 a.m. The crossing was slow. By 7 a.m., they were roughly halfway. The sun was up and temperature was rising. The assistant became increasingly concerned. They were entering the dangerous period. He urged Bethany to move faster. By 8:30 a.m., they were approximately 2/3 through. Temperature had risen above freezing. The icefall was audibly active. Constant creaking and groaning. Small chunks were falling from Seracs. At approximately 9 a.m., they were beneath a massive ice Serac, a tower roughly 60 feet tall and 40 feet wide, leaning at an angle. The Serac was marked with warning flags. Standard protocol was to move through quickly. The assistant told Bethany they needed to move through quickly without stopping. Bethany stated she needed to rest first. The guide explained firmly they could not rest here. Bethany sat down and said she needed 5 minutes. The guide told Bethany that if she didn't start moving in 60 seconds, he would descend without her. The guide started counting down. At 30 seconds, Bethany stood up, angry, and started moving. They were approximately 50 feet past the Serac, with perhaps another 100 feet before a clear, when the Serac collapsed. There was no warning. Roughly 1,000 tons of ice fell and impacted the route. The assistant, ahead on the rope, heard the collapse and dove forward. He was hit by smaller chunks, knocked down and partially buried, but survived with injuries. Bethany was directly in the path of the main mass. She had no time to react. The ice hit her with tremendous force, killing her instantly. Her body was buried under several tons of ice blocks. The assistant freed himself and radioed for help. The rescue team reached the site within 90 minutes. The recovery operation took 2 full days. Bethany's body was located approximately 15 feet below the surface, crushed by the ice. Death had been instantaneous from massive trauma. The official investigation determined the Serac collapse was a natural event that could not have been predicted with certainty. However, the investigation noted Bethany and her guide had been in the icefall during the dangerous late morning period when ice is most unstable, and that Bethany had delayed in a high-risk area despite warnings. It was April 12, 2014, and the pre-dawn darkness over Mount Everest's Khumbu icefall hung thick with the kind of ominous stillness that experienced climbers recognize as deceptive calm. The massive icefall stretched like a frozen battlefield across the route to Base Camp 1, its towering seracs and hidden crevasses creating a labyrinth of death that shifted and groaned with each degree of temperature change. Blake Forrester, a 33-year-old marketing director for Summit Dynamics, an outdoor gear manufacturer based in Boulder, Colorado, had built his career on understanding the relationship between equipment performance and extreme environments. His background included multiple technical ice climbs throughout the Rocky Mountains, but he had never attempted anything in the Himalayas. Forrester's reputation within the industry was built on his ability to secure high-profile expedition sponsorships and document gear performance in challenging conditions, making him valuable to a company that depended on authentic field testing for marketing credibility. The Mount Everest expedition represented the centerpiece of Summit Dynamics' spring marketing campaign designed to showcase their new high-altitude equipment line in the most demanding environment on Earth. Forrester had spent 8 months negotiating the sponsorship deal, securing media coverage, and coordinating with expedition leaders to ensure maximum marketing impact from the investment. The financial stakes for Forrester personally were significant beyond his immediate job security. He carried a mortgage on a Boulder home, student loan debt from his graduate studies, and had recently committed to a $15,000 investment in a small climbing guide service with his partner. Losing his position at Summit Dynamics would eliminate his ability to service these debts and potentially force the sale of his home in a challenging real estate market. The climbing industry's tight-knit nature meant that failure on such a high-profile expedition could damage his professional reputation for years. This expedition to Mount Everest represented the culmination of Summit Dynamics' 18-month marketing campaign for their new high-altitude equipment line. Forrester's expedition leader had cached critical prototype gear on a ledge in the Khumbu icefall during an emergency evacuation when a team member suffered severe altitude sickness. The cached equipment included revolutionary oxygen delivery systems, advanced insulation layers utilizing aerogel technology, and titanium alloy climbing hardware offering superior strength-to-weight ratios. These prototypes represented years of research and development, making their recovery essential for the company's upcoming product launch. Successful recovery and documentation would likely result in Forrester's promotion to marketing vice president, a position that came with significant salary increases and company equity participation. The marketing data from Everest would provide Summit Dynamics with competitive advantages and potential revenue, as authentic high-altitude testing remained the gold standard for equipment credibility in the mountaineering community. The Khumbu icefall is one of the most dangerous sections of the standard route up Mount Everest, where the glacier flows over a steep drop and fractures into a chaotic maze of crevasses and towering ice blocks called seracs. These seracs, some weighing hundreds of tons, shift constantly due to glacier movement and temperature fluctuations, making the icefall an active avalanche zone where death can strike without warning. At 19,200 feet elevation, the icefall's thin atmosphere and extreme cold create additional challenges for climbers attempting technical maneuvers. Temperature variations in the icefall can exceed 40 degrees Fahrenheit between night and early morning, creating thermal stress that weakens ice structures and triggers collapses. The optimal crossing time occurs between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m., when overnight freezing has maximally strengthened ice formations. But even during these safe hours, the probability of Serac collapse remains significant enough that most climbers minimize their exposure time through rapid movement. On the morning of April 12th, meteorological conditions appeared ideal for icefall travel, with clear skies, minimal wind, and temperatures holding steady around -15 degrees Fahrenheit at the 19,000-foot level. However, weather stations at base camp had recorded an unusual warming trend over the previous 72 hours, with daytime temperatures reaching 45 degrees Fahrenheit at lower elevations. This temperature differential created thermal stress throughout the icefall's ice formations, causing increased movement and instability that experienced climbers could detect through subtle audio cues and visual observations. The route through the icefall requires technical climbing skills, proper equipment, and intimate knowledge of current conditions that only experienced Himalayan guides possess. Standard protocol involves teams of climbers roped together, moving quickly through established routes while maintaining constant communication with base camp controllers who monitor conditions via telescope and radio contact. Solo travel through the icefall violates fundamental safety principles that have evolved through decades of climbing deaths and near misses. Icefall doctors, specialized Sherpa teams responsible for maintaining the route through the chaotic ice formations, had declared the standard path unsafe for the past 48 hours due to increased Serac movement observed during recent temperature fluctuations. These teams, whose lives depend on accurate assessment of ice conditions, had noted unusual creaking sounds from major Serac formations and observed fresh cracks appearing in previously stable ice structures. Their decision to close the route represented the consensus of the most experienced ice climbers in the world. Base camp managers had posted explicit warnings prohibiting solo entry into the icefall zone and stationed personnel at the primary access point to monitor the closure. The monitors, veteran climbing Sherpas with decades of Everest experience, had instructions to strongly discourage climbers from entering the icefall regardless of their stated intentions or urgency. Other climbing teams in the area, including groups with commercial pressures and tight scheduling requirements, had accepted the delay without question. Expedition leaders with millions of dollars invested in their climbs understood that attempting to navigate unstable terrain represented unacceptable risk regardless of financial consequences. Several teams had extended their base camp stays by a week, choosing to absorb additional costs rather than risk their members' lives. Forrester observed the ice conditions personally during the evening of April 11th, noting visible steam rising from crevasses as warmer air temperatures created sublimation of ice surfaces. He could hear the distinctive popping and cracking sounds that indicated thermal stress within ice formations, along with occasional thunderous crashes as smaller seracs collapsed in distant sections of the icefall. These observable warning signs reinforced the icefall doctor's professional assessment of dangerous conditions. Despite these clear indicators of instability, Forrester faced an impossible choice between his professional obligations and his personal safety. Summit Dynamics' sponsorship contract included a strict clause requiring the return of prototype equipment within 72 hours of expedition termination or face immediate contract cancellation and a $25,000 penalty for unreturned gear. The contract language, negotiated during a highly competitive bidding process, contained no provisions for force majeure or safety-related delays that might prevent equipment recovery. His company's financial situation added urgency to the gear recovery mission. Summit Dynamics had invested heavily in the Everest marketing campaign at the expense of other promotional activities, leaving their annual marketing budget stretched to its limits. Company executives had made clear that the prototype gear's performance documentation was essential for their autumn product launch, which represented their primary revenue opportunity for the following fiscal year. Failure to deliver the marketing materials could result in significant layoffs within the marketing department. Local Sherpa guides, whose intimate knowledge of icefall conditions had kept them alive through decades of Himalayan guiding, unanimously refused to accompany any recovery mission until the route reopened. Their refusal represented the strongest possible warning about current ice conditions, as Sherpa guides typically show remarkable tolerance for calculated risks when properly compensated. Even offers of triple the standard daily rate failed to persuade any guides to enter the icefall. demonstrating their assessment that the conditions presented unacceptable mortality risk. The Sherpa community's collective refusal carried particular weight given their economic dependence on climbing expeditions and reluctance to disappoint foreign climbers who provided essential family income. When guides who regularly accept dangerous assignments for modest pay refuse additional work, it indicates conditions exceeding even their considerable risk tolerance. Their unanimous position that gear recovery should wait represented professional consensus based on observable evidence of extreme danger. Even experienced expedition leaders at base camp, including climbers who had successfully summited Everest multiple times, advised Forrester to accept the financial penalty rather than attempt solo gear recovery in closed terrain. These leaders, whose reputations depended on accurate risk assessment and whose business models required managing client safety, understood the distinction between acceptable mountaineering risk and reckless endangerment. Forrester spent the evening of April 11th studying topographical maps and identifying an alternate access point that would bypass the guarded main route while still reaching his cached equipment. He located a secondary approach used primarily for emergency evacuations that accessed the icefall from the western margin, avoiding the main guard post while still providing access to the GPS coordinates where his team had stored the prototype gear. This route required additional technical climbing, but offered the possibility of reaching his objective without confronting base camp security. Before departing, he established comprehensive radio check protocols with base camp dispatch, scheduling contact every hour beginning at 8 a.m. to ensure monitoring of his safety throughout the operation. This communication plan was designed to enable rapid rescue response, though he understood that rescue operations in the icefall carried extreme risks for potential rescuers. Forrester's equipment selection reflected his understanding of the technical requirements while minimizing weight for rapid movement. He carried 200 feet of dynamic climbing rope rated for high-impact loads, a rack of ice climbing hardware, including screws and pickets for anchor construction, and a lightweight pack capable of holding the cached prototype gear. His personal protective equipment included an avalanche beacon, climbing helmet, and emergency bivouac gear sufficient for one night's survival at altitude. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, Forrester bypassed the route guard by accessing the icefall through the secondary emergency approach, following a narrow corridor between two large Seracs that provided concealment from the main base camp area. His headlamp illuminated the twisted landscape of ice blocks and crevasses as he picked his way carefully toward the GPS coordinates where his team had cached the equipment 7 days earlier. The route required technical climbing over several ice formations and careful navigation around crevasses that could prove fatal if he lost his footing. The morning temperature held steady around -12 degrees Fahrenheit at his elevation, providing optimal conditions for ice stability while he moved through the lower sections of the icefall. However, he observed fresh cracks in several ice formations that indicated recent movement, along with debris from minor collapses that had occurred during the previous day's warming cycle. The crevasse itself had widened by approximately 6 inches since his team's original crossing, requiring him to span a 12-foot gap rather than the 11-foot distance they had encountered the previous week. Forrester began installing his Tyrolean traverse system by identifying suitable anchor points on both sides of the crevasse that could withstand the forces generated by his rope system under load. This technique involves stretching a rope between 2 anchor points and using it as a bridge while hanging from a harness system, requiring precise placement of anchors capable of holding several times the climber's body weight under dynamic loading conditions. His anchor installation process involved drilling deep holes in solid ice using specialized screws designed for extreme load applications, then testing each placement by applying significant force to ensure that ice would hold under the stress of the complete traverse system. He installed primary and backup anchors on both sides of the crevasse that would prevent catastrophic failure if any single component failed under load. At 6:45 a.m., after over 2 hours of careful anchor installation, Forrester completed his anchor system and conducted comprehensive testing of the rope tension and anchor security by applying his full body weight while still positioned on the safe side of the crevasse. The ice anchors held firm during testing, and he observed no visible movement or stress indicators in the immediately surrounding ice formations. His load testing confirmed that the system could support his current body weight with appropriate safety margins. The gear cache contained exactly what Summit Dynamics required for their marketing campaign. The complete cache weighed approximately 40 pounds, representing a significant increase over his body weight that would substantially change the dynamics of his traverse system. Forrester methodically packed each piece of prototype equipment into his expedition pack. He photographed each item with a digital camera to document the gear's condition for the company's marketing materials, understanding that visual proof of the equipment's survival at extreme altitude would enhance its credibility with potential customers. As he arranged the gear to optimize weight distribution, he positioned the heaviest items closest to his back to maintain proper center of gravity, while ensuring that fragile components were protected by clothing layers and positioned away from potential impact points. The loaded pack created bulk that would complicate his movement on the traverse system. At 7:15 a.m., Forrester began his return crossing with the full gear load, immediately noticing the significant difference in the system's behavior under the increased weight. The loaded pack shifted his center of gravity and required constant adjustment to maintain proper position relative to the traverse line. Halfway across the crevasse, he observed hairline cracks developing around his primary ice anchor point, where the increased loading was concentrating stress in the surrounding ice formation. Despite the visible signs of stress in his anchor system, the traverse continued to support his weight as he progressed toward the safe side of the crevasse. After progressing slowly for nearly 10 minutes due to the additional weight, he estimated that he had covered approximately 8 feet of the 12-foot crossing when the temperature-related failure sequence began. Morning sunlight, reflecting off snow surfaces and concentrating in the protected crevasse environment, had begun raising local temperatures above the critical threshold where ice formations lose their structural integrity. The failure occurred simultaneously from multiple stress points as thermal expansion and the dynamic loading of his traverse system combined to exceed the structural capacity of his anchor installation. At 7:25 a.m., his primary anchor point catastrophically failed when the ice formation holding his traverse system suddenly cracked and shifted under the combined effects of thermal stress. The anchor failure created an immediate shock load that propagated through the ice structure above the crevasse. For several seconds, the ice groaned ominously before this shock loading triggered the collapse of a massive Serac estimated to weigh over 2 tons that had been held in position by ice structures now compromised by thermal cycling and the vibrations from Forrester's anchor failure. The Serac collapse sequence happened with terrifying speed as the towering ice formation, destabilized by the anchor failure and morning temperature increase, broke free from its foundation with a thunderous crack that echoed throughout the icefall. The massive ice block, roughly 15 feet tall and 8 feet wide, plummeted toward the crevasse crossing where Forrester hung suspended and helpless on his failed traverse system, with no opportunity to escape the falling debris. Forrester's position at the moment of Serac impact placed him directly beneath the falling ice mass, suspended approximately 20 feet above the crevasse floor and unable to reach either side of the crossing before the collapse reached his location. The failed anchor had eliminated his ability to continue the traverse, while the bulk and weight of his gear pack prevented rapid movement that might have allowed escape from the impact zone. The impact was instantaneous and devastating as the 2-ton ice block struck Forrester with the kinetic energy of a falling building, crushing his body completely while simultaneously destroying his rope system and scattering the recovered prototype equipment across a 50-foot debris field. The massive force compressed his chest cavity, severing his spinal cord and crushing vital organs. Death was immediate as the overwhelming trauma exceeded the human body's capacity to maintain life functions. The Serac's impact drove Forrester's body deep into the fresh ice debris. The prototype equipment he had risked his life to recover was embedded throughout the debris field, some pieces driven 30 feet from the impact site by the force of the collapse. His avalanche beacon continued transmitting from beneath approximately 15 feet of compacted ice fragments that had set into a concrete hard mass within minutes of the collapse. The thunderous crash of the Serac collapse echoed across the icefall and reached base camp over a mile away at exactly 7:27 a.m., where expedition leaders immediately recognized the distinctive sound of a major ice collapse. Radio operators attempted to contact Forrester for his scheduled 8 a.m. check-in, but received only silence from his radio frequency. His failure to respond triggered immediate concern among base camp personnel who understood the implications of missed communications in the icefall environment. Base camp dispatch immediately organized a search and rescue team despite the dangerous conditions. Understanding that any remote chance of survival required immediate response, regardless of the risks to rescuers. The rescue team, composed of experienced Sherpa guides and Western climbers with technical rescue training, departed base camp at 8:30 a.m., carrying specialized equipment for crevasse rescue and medical emergencies. The rescue team reached Forrester's last known position at 9:15 a.m., where they immediately detected his avalanche beacon signal emanating from beneath the fresh ice debris. The signal strength indicated burial at a depth that would require hours of excavation with heavy tools, while the continued instability of surrounding Seracs made any prolonged work in the area extremely dangerous for the rescue team members. Scattered pieces of climbing gear and prototype equipment were visible on the surface of the debris field, confirming the location of the collapse and providing evidence of the violence of the Serac impact. The rescue team leader made the difficult decision that excavation would present unacceptable risk to additional lives, particularly given the depth of the beacon signal and the obvious severity of the impact trauma that had occurred. The coroner's report, filed without body recovery due to the dangerous conditions and depth of burial, listed the cause of death as massive traumatic injuries due to Serac collapse, with contributing factors including violation of icefall closure protocols, solo travel in unstable terrain, and equipment failure under excessive loading. The report noted that death would have been instantaneous, given the magnitude of the impact forces involved in the collapse. GPS coordinates of Forrester's burial site were permanently marked in expedition databases as a location to avoid, with notes about the Serac collapse pattern and remaining debris field. It was May 14th, 2015. On Everest's northeast ridge, above the upper camps, climbers prepared for a summit push. Pre-dawn darkness, high winds, and blowing snow reduced visibility to near zero. Temperatures were far below freezing, and the steep, exposed terrain left little room for error. Garrett Holbrook, 43, was the founder of a successful analytics company and had limited high-altitude climbing experience. He had completed a single major ascent several years earlier, but had ambitious goals for Everest. Holbrook hired a budget outfitter rather than an established expedition operator and planned to climb above the highest camps without supplemental oxygen or support team. He sought a rapid summit time and often dismissed traditional guidance as overly cautious. Against repeated advice from guides, he intended to navigate the most dangerous sections alone, relying on GPS rather than visible route markers. The ridge terrain between the upper camps included steep ice slopes, narrow ledges, and exposed faces. Winds reached extreme velocities, driving a spindrift snow across the surface and reducing sightlines to near zero. Temperatures were well below freezing, and the combination of high altitude and exposure created conditions where even small errors could quickly become fatal. In the death zone, oxygen levels are severely reduced, and prolonged exposure can rapidly impair judgment, coordination, and decision-making. Weather reports had warned of high winds, and several other teams had already turned back at lower camps. Despite the warnings, Holbrook continued past the fixed ropes, moving into terrain that required careful step-by-step navigation. He relied solely on his GPS device to follow the route, rather than descending to regain the established line marked by prior climbers. Tracking data later indicated he had drifted several hundred yards east of the correct path, placing him above exposed ice slopes that dropped sharply to either side. Attempting to traverse back across a steep, 60-degree incline Without fixed protection, he lost secure footing on wind-scoured blue ice. During the fall, loose ice and small rock fragments were dislodged, striking the slope and contributing to additional impacts. The uneven and unstable terrain increased the force of each collision, while wind and spindrift snow reduced friction and made footing more unpredictable. These conditions compounded the injuries sustained and made it clear that any attempt to regain balance or slow the fall would have been extremely difficult. The slip initiated a long, uncontrolled fall. The initial impact shattered both legs and caused severe cranial trauma as he struck jagged rock outcroppings. Momentum carried him further down the slope, and successive impacts fractured his spine and caused extensive soft tissue injuries. Drag marks in the snow indicated that he attempted to crawl or move after the fall, suggesting he remained conscious for several moments despite massive trauma. Blood loss, combined with sub-zero temperatures and altitude-related exhaustion, eventually overcame him, leading to rapid unconsciousness and death. A local guide discovered Holbrook's body during a search initiated after he failed to check in with the base camp. Helicopter recovery was impossible due to altitude and ongoing storms, and the ground team required several hours to reach the site. Recovery operations were delayed by poor visibility and technical terrain, taking multiple days to complete. An official post-mortem examination listed massive traumatic injuries and blood loss as the primary cause of death, with hypothermia and altitude-induced impairment noted as contributing factors. GPS data confirmed a significant deviation from the standard route. The incident received limited media coverage, and the family requested privacy. Holbrook's attempt highlighted the extreme risks of high-altitude climbing when standard safety practices are ignored. Soloing, foregoing supplemental oxygen, and relying on navigation tools rather than visual markers compounded the hazards. Extreme weather, steep terrain, and the physiological effects of the death zone leave little margin for error. This incident serves as a reminder of the importance of preparation, experience, and adherence to established protocols in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. It was May 15, 2014. The summit window on Mount Everest had opened. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, climbers prepared for summit pushes. Among them was a woman whose confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. Darcy Sutherland was 41 from Boulder, Colorado. She'd climbed all 58 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks and completed mountaineering courses. By Colorado standards, she was experienced. However, Colorado's highest peak tops, out at 14,440 feet, where air contains 60% of sea-level oxygen. Everest's summit has only 33%. She'd chosen a cheaper expedition company, reasoning she didn't need hand-holding. She'd been vocal during the trek, telling others that most Everest clients were tourists with no business on a serious mountain. Most significantly, Darcy decided she would not use supplemental oxygen, considering this the only legitimate way to summit. Her guide strongly advised against it, explaining fewer than 200 people had summited without oxygen, all elite mountaineers. Darcy dismissed this. During acclimatization, Darcy's confidence seemed justified. She moved quickly, often outpacing others. Her oxygen saturation stayed in the low 70s at Camp 2. She unclipped from fixed ropes on sections she deemed easy. Her guide repeatedly told her to stay clipped in. Darcy argued she'd been climbing 15 years. On May 15th, Darcy's team moved to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. Her oxygen saturation was 68%, good, especially without supplemental oxygen. That evening, the guide emphasized everyone would use oxygen from Camp 4 onward, non-negotiable. After 30 minutes of argument, Darcy reluctantly agreed to carry oxygen, but made clear she intended to summit without it if possible. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 17th. Darcy struggled more than expected, arriving noticeably fatigued. Her oxygen saturation was 62%. The summit push began at 9 p.m. Darcy started with oxygen at 2 liters per minute. At 27,000 feet, she removed her mask. The guide told her to put it back on. Darcy ignored him. Her pace slowed noticeably. Her movements became less coordinated. At the balcony at 27,500 feet, the guide checked her equipment. She turned off the flow valve. He turned it back on and stated if she turned it off again, he would end her summit attempt immediately. At 28,000 feet as dawn broke, Darcy's coordination became impaired. She stumbled on flat ground. The guide recognized cerebral hypoxia and increased her oxygen flow. They reached the south summit at 28,700 feet around 6:30 a.m. Darcy sat heavily. Her response was slow, words slurred. The guide performed a coordination test. Darcy missed his finger twice. Clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The guide told Darcy they needed to descend immediately. Darcy refused. The guide radioed base camp. They advised immediate descent. Darcy stood and walked towards the summit, not down. The guide grabbed her arm. Darcy pulled away. At 28,700 feet, he barely had strength to move himself, let alone restrain a client. He followed, hoping to convince her to turn around. Darcy continued at extremely slow pace. Other climbers passed. Several asked if everything was okay. The guide said his client showed cerebral edema signs but refused to descend. At 7:30 a.m., Darcy reached the traverse below the Hillary step. Her movements were uncoordinated. Halfway across, she stopped, swaying. The guide grabbed her harness. Her eyes were unfocused. She didn't seem to recognize him. The guide turned her around and clipped her, facing downward. Darcy didn't respond but moved when pushed. After approximately 100 feet, her legs buckled. She couldn't support her weight. Her consciousness was declining rapidly. The guide radioed for emergency assistance. He tried dragging her, but moving an incapacitated person at that altitude was nearly impossible. Over 30 minutes, Darcy deteriorated. She became unresponsive. Her breathing became irregular. At 8:15 a.m., she lost consciousness. The guide checked for a pulse, weak and rapid. He tried dragging her toward the south summit, but managed only 50 feet over 20 minutes, exhausting himself to the point of risking his own life. At 8:45 a.m., Darcy stopped breathing. Rescue breathing at 28,600 feet was ineffective. He checked for a pulse. None. Darcy Sutherland was dead. The guide radioed that his client had died. He was instructed to descend immediately. He moved her body slightly off the main route and descended. Days later, a team attempted to move her body but found it frozen in place. Official cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of inadequate supplemental oxygen use, continued ascent despite symptoms, and refusal to descend when advised. The guide's radio logs documented his repeated warnings and Darcy's refusals. Darcy Sutherland's body remains on Everest at approximately 28,550 feet, visible to climbers who pass that section. It was March 15, 2016. At 29,032 feet above sea level, in the death zone of Mount Everest where oxygen levels drop to 1/3 of the sea level, and the human body begins dying with each passing minute, another climber had collapsed. The southeast ridge stretched upward through howling winds and sub-zero temperatures, its narrow path carved between towering ice formations and exposed rock faces. Dara Whitfield was 34, a marketing coordinator from Portland who spent most weekends binge-watching documentaries on her couch. She had no athletic background beyond occasional yoga classes and considered a local waterfall hike her biggest outdoor achievement. Her daily routine consisted of 8 hours at a desk job, takeout dinners, and Netflix marathons that stretched past midnight. She owned a gym membership she hadn't used in 2 years and got winded climbing the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. 3 months earlier, she'd watched a climbing documentary that made summiting Everest look like an expensive but achievable bucket list item. The film focused on guided expeditions and portrayed the mountain as dangerous but conquerable with proper support. Dara told friends and co-workers that ordinary people could do extraordinary things with the right equipment and guidance. The documentary had featured several amateur climbers who reached the summit with minimal experience, and Dara repeatedly referenced these examples when explaining her decision to attempt the climb. When questioned about her lack of climbing experience, she dismissed concerns by pointing to the film's examples of successful novice climbers. She purchased expensive gear and spent weeks learning how to use each piece, watching instructional videos, and practicing in her apartment. She also invested in a personal trainer for 2 months to improve her basic fitness level. The summit push began at Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, during a narrow weather window that opened after 3 days of waiting in deteriorating conditions. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with 60 miles per hour winds that created a wind chill. approaching minus 80 degrees. At this altitude, oxygen levels are 1/3 of sea level, causing rapid physical and mental deterioration in even the most experienced climbers. The human body literally begins dying in the death zone, as cells break down faster than they can repair themselves. Most experienced climbers spend less than 16 hours above 26,000 feet to minimize exposure to these lethal conditions. The mountain's upper reaches present a landscape of exposed rock, ice, and snow where every step requires deliberate effort and precise foot placement. Jet stream winds regularly exceed 100 miles per hour, creating conditions where exposed skin freezes in minutes and wind-driven ice particles feel like sandpaper against any exposed flesh. The thin air makes every movement exhausting, and climbers must rest after every few steps to avoid complete collapse from oxygen deprivation. Dara's body, completely unaccustomed to altitude, was already showing signs of severe acute mountain sickness at base camp weeks earlier. Her resting heart rate had increased from 65 beats per minute at sea level to 110 beats per minute at 17,400 feet. She experienced persistent headaches that felt like someone driving nails into her skull, nausea that prevented her from eating solid food, and difficulty sleeping that left her exhausted before each day's activities. Her oxygen saturation levels consistently measured below normal ranges, indicating her body's inability to efficiently process the limited oxygen available at altitude. Her expedition leader expressed serious concerns about Dara's fitness level during the acclimatization rotations up the Khumbu icefall. She struggled to complete basic tasks at 17,000 feet that experienced climbers handled routinely without breathing hard. During the first rotation to Camp 1, she required frequent rest stops every 50 feet and fell behind the group's pace by over an hour. Her breathing became labored after minimal exertion, sounding like someone who had just sprinted a mile, and she showed visible signs of distress, including pale skin, trembling hands, and cold sweats that soaked through her base layers. The guide noticed that Dara couldn't maintain her balance on relatively flat terrain and stumbled frequently over small rocks and ice formations that other climbers navigated easily. Her coordination was noticeably impaired, and she had difficulty performing simple tasks, like clipping and unclipping her safety harness from fixed ropes. When other climbers offered advice about technique or gear usage, she listened carefully and tried to implement their suggestions, though she sometimes became frustrated when her body couldn't execute what her mind understood. At the second camp at 21,000 feet, she vomited repeatedly and couldn't keep food down for more than an hour at a time. The vomit was initially clear liquid, then progressed to yellow bile as her stomach emptied completely. Her appetite disappeared entirely, and she lost 12 pounds in 5 days, leaving her face gaunt and her climbing harness adorned loose around her shrinking waist. Despite her physical struggles, Dara showed remarkable determination and mental toughness, continuing to wake up each morning ready to attempt the day's objectives. She was a quick learner when it came to basic rope work and showed excellent judgment about weather conditions, often being the first to notice incoming storms. Her movements became increasingly clumsy due to altitude effects, and she dropped essential gear multiple times, including her water bottle and spare gloves that had to be retrieved by other team members. However, she demonstrated strong problem-solving skills and remained calm under pressure during technical sections of the climb. Dara's coordination became noticeably impaired beyond normal altitude effects, and she stumbled frequently while walking on the level ground inside the camp. Her speech became slurred, and she appeared confused about basic instructions that she had understood clearly at lower altitudes. She would stare blankly when given directions and often ask the same questions repeatedly within minutes. During conversations with other climbers, Dara's responses became increasingly disconnected from reality. She spoke confidently about reaching the summit while simultaneously complaining about symptoms that clearly indicated severe altitude sickness. When experienced climbers shared stories about previous expeditions, she would interrupt with references to her documentary, insisting that the film had shown her everything she needed to know about high-altitude climbing. During the final acclimatization rotation to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet, Dara had developed a persistent cough that produced pink-tinged sputum, indicating early signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema as fluid began accumulating in her lungs. She also complained of severe chest pain that worsened with deep breathing and felt like someone sitting on her chest. The guide measured her oxygen saturation at 68% using a pulse oximeter, well below the 85%, but at minimum considered safe for continued ascent. Normal oxygen saturation at sea level ranges from 95 to 100%, meaning her blood was carrying dangerously inadequate oxygen to her vital organs. Her fingernails and lips showed a blue tinge called cyanosis, indicating severe oxygen deprivation that was becoming life-threatening. Dara's sleep became increasingly disrupted by a condition called Cheney-Stokes breathing, where her respiratory rate would increase rapidly, then slow down, then stop entirely for up to 30 seconds before resuming. This irregular breathing pattern indicated her brain's respiratory control centers were being affected by oxygen deprivation and altitude-induced swelling. She would wake up gasping for air multiple times each night, leaving her exhausted and disoriented each morning. The night before the summit push, Dara's oxygen saturation levels dropped to 72%, despite supplemental oxygen flowing at 2 liters per minute, and she was showing early signs of cerebral edema, including severe headache, projectile vomiting, and difficulty maintaining balance while standing still. The guide recommended she descend immediately, explaining that her symptoms indicated life-threatening altitude sickness that would only worsen with further ascent to the death zone. She referenced the documentary she'd watched repeatedly, claiming that people in similar condition had pushed through and made it to the summit. The guide explained that those were experienced climbers with years of high-altitude training and physiological adaptations that she lacked entirely, including increased red blood cell counts and enlarged lung capacity developed over years of altitude exposure. Dara dismissed his concerns and said the film showed that determination was more important than experience or physical conditioning. She insisted that if she just followed the same route and used supplemental oxygen, like in the documentary, she would be fine. When the guide explained the specific medical dangers she faced, including brain swelling that could cause coma or death, and fluid in her lungs that could cause drowning at altitude, Dara accused him of trying to prevent her from achieving her dream. She threatened to find another guide or attempt the summit alone if he refused to continue, a threat that would likely result in her death within hours. The guide faced an impossible decision between abandoning a paying client who might attempt a solo summit in her deteriorated mental state or continuing with someone clearly unfit for the ascent. He documented her refusal to descend and her threats to continue alone, creating a legal record that she was making informed decisions against medical advice. At 11:30 p.m. on March 14th, the summit team began their final ascent from Camp 4 in conditions that tested even experienced climbers. Dara required assistance putting on her gear and couldn't operate her headlamp without help, fumbling with the simple on-off switch for several minutes. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated, and she stumbled twice while walking the short distance from her tent to the departure point. The guide noted her labored breathing and glassy-eyed expression, but felt obligated to honor her insistence on continuing. The initial ascent proceeded slowly, as Dara fell behind the group's pace within the first hour, creating a dangerous situation as other climbing teams backed up behind them on the narrow route. At 25,500 feet, she stopped frequently to rest and complained of severe dizziness that made her feel like the mountain was spinning around her. Her oxygen flow rate was set to 4 liters per minute, near maximum flow, but her untrained cardiovascular system couldn't efficiently utilize even the enriched air mixture. The guide stayed close to her position, recognizing the increasing signs of altitude-related illness that were becoming more severe with each 100 feet of elevation gain. Dara's speech became increasingly slurred, and she began making statements that didn't make sense, including asking about weather conditions while standing in a clear night with visible stars. Her coordination deteriorated to the point where she needed assistance with each step on technical sections. Despite her deteriorating condition, Dara maintained her methodical approach, carefully checking her gear at each rest stop and following the guide's instructions precisely when she could understand them. She showed flashes of her former competence, correctly identifying potential hazards on the route and suggesting safer alternatives for the anchor points. At 26,800 feet, Dara began showing signs of severe confusion, asking the guide multiple times what mountain they were climbing and seeming genuinely surprised by his answers. She complained that her vision was becoming blurry and that she was seeing double images of her headlamp beam. These symptoms indicated that brain swelling was affecting her visual cortex and cognitive functions in ways that would only worsen with continued ascent. Her breathing became increasingly labored, despite maximum oxygen flow, and she began making a rattling sound with each breath that indicated fluid accumulation in her lungs. The guide recognized this as a sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema progressing to dangerous levels. Dara's lips and fingernails showed increasing cyanosis, turning from pink to blue to almost purple as her blood oxygen levels continued dropping. At 27,500 feet, she began stumbling more frequently and couldn't maintain her balance on relatively flat sections of the route. Her movements became unsteady and unpredictable, and she veered towards the edge of the narrow ridge multiple times, requiring the guide to physically restrain her from walking off the mountain. She seemed unaware of the danger and became irritated when he prevented her from moving in directions that would have resulted in a fatal fall. Dara's mental state continued deteriorating as they approached 28,000 feet. She began talking to people who weren't there, having conversations with characters from the documentary she'd watched. She would stop climbing and gesture toward empty space, apparently responding to voices that only she could hear. The guide realized she was experiencing hallucinations caused by severe brain swelling and oxygen deprivation. At 2:47 a.m., approximately 1,000 feet below the summit on the southeast ridge near the balcony area, Dara collapsed without warning during what appeared to be a normal rest stop. Her legs simply gave out, and she fell forward onto the snow-covered rock face, landing hard on her knees and then pitching forward onto her face. Her supplemental oxygen had been flowing at maximum rate for 6 hours, but her untrained body couldn't process even the enriched air efficiently enough to prevent complete system failure. The guide immediately checked her vital signs and found her pulse rapid and weak at 145 beats per minute, indicating her heart was working desperately to pump oxygen-depleted blood to her vital organs. Her breathing was shallow and rapid at 35 breaths per minute, more than double the normal rate, as her body attempted to compensate for the lack of available oxygen at extreme altitude. She began exhibiting clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, including severe confusion, complete loss of coordination, and profoundly altered mental state. When the guide asked her basic questions like her name and location, she gave incoherent responses that consisted of random words, strung together without meaning. Her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light from his headlamp, indicating increased pressure in her brain from fluid accumulation that was compressing vital neural structures. The guide immediately recognized the life-threatening symptoms and began emergency descent procedures, knowing that every minute at this altitude was causing further brain damage. He attempted to help her stand, but Dara's legs couldn't support her weight, and she collapsed again within seconds, her knees buckling completely. Her speech became completely unintelligible, consisting of mumbled words and sounds that made no sense, interspersed with long periods of silence where she stared blankly at the snow. Despite her deteriorating mental state, she kept making weak gestures toward the summit and seemed to believe she was still climbing upward rather than lying collapsed on the mountain. Her movements were uncoordinated and purposeless, like someone trying to swim while lying on dry ground. The guide realized her brain was so oxygen-starved that she had lost all awareness of her actual situation and physical position. Dara became combative and disoriented when the guide tried to turn her around for descent, a common symptom of severe cerebral edema, as brain swelling affects personality and judgment centers. She pushed away his attempts to help with surprising strength for someone in her condition and crawled forward on her hands and knees toward the summit, moving only a few feet before collapsing again from exhaustion. Her movements were erratic and uncontrolled, and she seemed unaware that she was crawling rather than walking. Even in her severely altered mental state, she kept making disconnected statements about reaching the top like the climbers in the documentary, her obsession with the film persisting even as her brain function deteriorated. She would mumble fragments of scenes she remembered, mixing them with her current situation in ways that showed complete disconnection from reality. The guide realized she was experiencing severe delirium caused by brain swelling and oxygen starvation. At 28,200 feet, after crawling approximately 50 feet uphill in her delusional state, she suffered a complete physical collapse that left her unconscious on the narrow ridge. Her brain, starved of oxygen and swelling from fluid accumulation, began shutting down non-essential functions to preserve vital areas controlling breathing and heart rate. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, with long pauses between breaths that indicated respiratory failure as her brain stem struggled to maintain basic life functions. The guide checked for a pulse and found it weak and erratic, dropping from 145 beats per minute to 40 beats per minute as her cardiovascular system began failing under the extreme stress of altitude and cerebral edema. Her skin became cold and clammy despite the insulated clothing, indicating that her body was shutting down circulation to extremities to preserve blood flow to vital organs. Her breathing pattern became increasingly abnormal, following the Cheney-Stokes pattern, where respirations would increase in rate and depth, then gradually decrease, then stop entirely for periods lasting up to 45 seconds before resuming. This irregular breathing indicated that the respiratory control centers in her brain stem were being compressed by swelling tissue and were no longer functioning normally. The guide immediately radioed base camp for emergency evacuation, but helicopter rescue was impossible due to high winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and the extreme altitude that prevented aircraft operation above 26,000 feet under any conditions. The nearest helicopter landing zone was at base camp, over 11,000 feet below their current position, and requiring descent through technical terrain that would take hours even for an experienced climber. He attempted to drag her down the mountain, grabbing her under the arms and pulling her backward down the slope. At 150 pounds of dead weight plus 25 pounds of gear, progress was impossibly slow in the thin air where every step required enormous effort and left him gasping for breath. After moving her only 30 feet in 10 minutes, he realized that dragging her at this pace would take hours they didn't have, and his own oxygen supply was running dangerously low. Dar's breathing became increasingly irregular with periods of complete respiratory arrest lasting up to 30 seconds, followed by brief periods of rapid, shallow breathing. Her skin turned blue from lack of oxygen, starting with her lips and fingernails and spreading to her face and neck. Her body temperature began dropping rapidly in the minus 40-degree conditions as her circulation failed and her body lost the ability to generate heat. The guide continued dragging her downward for over 200 vertical feet, stopping every few minutes to check her vital signs and adjust her oxygen mask. Her condition showed no improvement despite the slight decrease in altitude, indicating that the brain damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation and swelling had progressed beyond the point where descent could reverse the process. Her pulse became increasingly weak and irregular, sometimes disappearing entirely for several seconds before returning. At 3:23 a.m., while positioned on a small ledge at 28,000 feet, Dara's breathing stopped entirely during one of the respiratory pauses and did not resume. The guide immediately began rescue breathing, removing her oxygen mask and forcing air into her lungs while checking for a pulse in her neck. Her heart continued beating weakly for several minutes, but her brain had been without adequate oxygen for too long to sustain life, and the swelling had compressed vital structures beyond recovery. The guide attempted resuscitation efforts for 12 minutes, alternating between rescue breathing and chest compressions while fighting his own oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude. His efforts were hampered by the bulky winter clothing, the awkward position on the narrow ledge, and his own exhaustion from hours of climbing and the stress of the emergency. Her heart eventually stopped responding to resuscitation attempts, and her body became completely still. The extreme altitude and his own oxygen deprivation made continued efforts impossible as the guide began showing signs of altitude sickness himself, including severe headache and nausea that indicated that he was approaching his own physiological limits. He realized that continuing resuscitation attempts would likely result in his own death without any possibility of saving Dara, whose brain damage was clearly irreversible. The guide's radio call reached base camp at 4:15 a.m., reporting Dara's death and his own precarious position on the mountain with limited oxygen supplies. No rescue aircraft could operate at that altitude in the current weather conditions, and the nearest medical facility was a 12-hour descent away under ideal conditions that didn't exist in the current storm. Other climbing teams in the area were dealing with their own emergencies as 2 other climbers had also collapsed that night during the same weather window, stretching rescue resources beyond capacity. The guide remained with Dara's body for 2 hours, using the time to rest and conserve his remaining oxygen while waiting for weather conditions to improve enough for safe descent. He documented the scene with photographs and GPS coordinates for the official report and future body recovery efforts. The extreme conditions and remote location made immediate body recovery impossible, requiring specialized teams and favorable weather that wouldn't occur for weeks. His own oxygen supply was running critically low, and he began showing symptoms of altitude sickness that would become life-threatening if he remained at that elevation much longer. He marked her location with GPS coordinates and left identifying information with the body for future recovery efforts, then began his own descent before conditions deteriorated further. The decision to leave her body was difficult, but necessary to prevent a second fatality. Dara's body remained on the mountain for 10 days until weather conditions and logistics allowed a recovery team to reach her location at 28,000 feet. The recovery required a team of experienced high-altitude climbers who spent 2 days reaching her position, and another day preparing the body for transport down the mountain through technical terrain that required specialized equipment and techniques. The regional medical facility conducted a thorough examination after the body's recovery. The official report listed cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by pulmonary edema, both conditions directly caused by her body's inability to function at extreme altitude. Contributing factors included inadequate physical conditioning, insufficient acclimatization time, and an underlying heart murmur that she had never disclosed during medical screening, which made her cardiovascular system unable to cope with the extreme demands of high-altitude climbing. The case was ruled an accidental death with no criminal liability assigned to the expedition company. Investigators noted that the victim had misrepresented her medical history and physical capabilities during the screening process, signing waivers that acknowledged the extreme risks involved. The climbing outfitters' existing medical questionnaires and liability waivers were deemed legally sufficient, and no policy changes were implemented following the incident. It was April 22, 2015. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was underway, with expedition teams making acclimatization rotations. At base camp at 17,600 feet, climbers were preparing for their second rotation. Tessa Hargrove was 39, a lifestyle blogger from Scottsdale, Arizona. Everest was her most ambitious project, a series she'd pre-sold to outdoor gear companies as sponsored content. She'd spent more money on camera equipment than proper cold weather gear. Her jacket was rated only to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, inadequate for Everest where temperatures drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. During the trek to base camp, Tessa complained constantly about accommodations, food, and pace. She treated porters dismissively, referring to them as the help. At tea houses, she insisted on private rooms and threatened bad reviews when told she'd have to share. During the first rotation, Tessa stopped frequently for photos, forcing others to wait. When teammates expressed frustration, she responded that her sponsors expected content and she was paying for the expedition. At Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, she spent 2 hours staging tent photos while teammates rested. On April 22nd, the team began their second rotation through the Khumbu icefall. The climb started at 3 a.m. when ice was most stable. Tessa moved slowly, stopping repeatedly. Other climbers had to navigate around her. When her guide urged her to maintain pace, she snapped that he was being unprofessional and she'd document his attitude for the expedition company. At one point, she removed her gloves for 5 minutes to operate her camera in -15 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, demanding her guide hold her ice axe. Her fingers turned white, then red. The guide told her to put gloves back on. Tessa accused him of overreacting. They reached Camp 1 and continued to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet the next day. At Camp 2, Tessa's oxygen saturation was 68%, acceptable. She complained of headache and fatigue, but dismissed these as minor. The plan was to rest briefly, then descend to Camp 1 before nightfall. At 2 p.m., as the team prepared to descend, Tessa announced she was staying longer to photograph the Lhasa face. Her guide explained they needed to descend before afternoon heat destabilized the route. Tessa responded that her sponsors expected specific shots, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. She'd paid for this expedition and would decide when to leave. After heated argument, the guide gave her a deadline. 2:30 p.m. Tessa spent 30 minutes taking photographs, changing jackets 3 times for different looks. She demanded other climbers move out of her frame. Each time she removed layers, her body lost heat. By departure, her fingers were numb. The guide examined her hands. Early frostbite. Tessa blamed him for not warning her properly. The descent was slow. Tessa's coordination was impaired. She stumbled repeatedly. By 4 p.m., they'd only descended halfway. At approximately 19,800 feet, Tessa sat down, saying she needed rest. The guide checked her oxygen saturation, 62%. Her speech was slurred. He urged her to continue. She stood but sat back down, reporting dizziness and nausea. The guide recognized acute mountain sickness and administered emergency oxygen. The oxygen helped initially, but Tessa couldn't walk. The guide and assistant began dragging her downward. Progress was agonizingly slow. At approximately 5:15 p.m., at 19,600 feet, Tessa suddenly pulled away and stumbled sideways off the route. She took 3 steps onto untracked snow. The snow collapsed beneath her. She'd stepped onto a snow bridge, covering a crevasse. The bridge gave way, and Tessa fell through. The guide rushed to the edge. The crevasse was 8 feet wide, narrowing as it descended. He could see Tessa approximately 40 feet down, wedged between ice walls, not moving. He called her name repeatedly. No response. He radioed an emergency call. A rescue team arrived 90 minutes later after dark. A rescuer descended and reached Tessa 40 feet below the surface. Wedged between ice walls, the rescuer checked for vital signs. None. Tessa was dead. Her oxygen mask had been torn off during the fall. Recovery took 3 hours. Tessa's body was brought to Camp 1, then carried to base camp the next day. The official cause of death was trauma from the fall, combined with hypoxia and hypothermia. Contributing factors included altitude sickness, inadequate cold weather gear leading to frostbite, and exhaustion from prioritizing photography over proper acclimatization. The guide's logs documented repeated warnings, her dismissive responses, and threats regarding his conduct. Her camera was recovered with her body, containing hundreds of photos from the days before her death. The expedition company added protocols requiring guides to confiscate cameras if clients prioritized photography over safety. Tessa Hargrove's body was returned to Arizona for burial. It was May 7th, 2013, and the western CWM on Mount Everest stretched beneath towering faces of Nuptse and Lhasa. The glacier valley looked peaceful under the morning sun, but avalanches and unstable snow lurked, leaving no room for error. Maxwell Grace, 35, was a quantitative hedge fund manager from Greenwich, Connecticut, who had built an $890 million fund by applying complex algorithms to market patterns, analyzing risk with mathematical precision, and optimizing returns through data-driven models. His success relied on his ability to process vast amounts of information and identify patterns invisible to most. Grace approached mountaineering the same way, studying weather trends, avalanche statistics, and historical accident data. Yet his climbing experience was limited. Prior expeditions to Mount Rainier, Mount Whitney, and Kilimanjaro had provided minimal exposure to technical Himalayan terrain. For Everest, he relied on minimal Sherpa support, confident his analytical methods would allow him to navigate the Western CWM safely. Grace began his ascent of the Western CWM in the morning, departing with sufficient daylight to traverse the glacier valley. Weather briefings at base camp had warned of elevated avalanche risk due to recent snowfall and warming temperatures. Despite these warnings, Grace calculated the probability of an avalanche as acceptably low based on historical data. By mid-morning, Grace was making his way across a broad section of the Western CWM, the glacier valley funneling climbers beneath the towering, snow-laden faces of Nuptse and Lhotse. The slopes above him were heavily loaded with winter snow, shaped by persistent winds into slabs of densely packed, cohesive layers. Unbeknownst to him, thermal expansion and gravitational stress had created critical weaknesses in one of these slabs high above the valley floor. At 1,200 feet above his position, the snow fractured along a hidden tension line, the initial crack propagating almost instantly across the slope, releasing a massive sheet of snow and ice, poised to gather destructive momentum. Within moments, the slab accelerated down the steep incline, combining with loose ice and debris to form a chaotic avalanche. The mass gained velocity rapidly, reaching speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour as it funneled toward the valley floor. Rocks and ice embedded in the moving snow added both weight and unpredictable motion, creating a violent, tumbling mass that would be nearly impossible for anyone in its path to evade. Grace, directly beneath the release point, had only seconds to react as the avalanche transformed the serene glacier valley into a deadly torrent of snow, ice, and debris. Grace was caught directly in the path of the avalanche and instinctively tried to escape by running laterally across the slope. The tumbling mass of snow collided with him repeatedly, triggering small secondary slides that dislodged rocks and ice from above. Each collision increased the velocity of the debris and compounded the instability of the slope. Despite his efforts, the chaotic flow of snow and ice left him no chance to regain footing, and the sheer force of the moving mass made any controlled movement impossible. Within seconds, Grace was swept under a dense accumulation of snow, estimated at 8 to 10 feet deep, with large rocks and ice embedded throughout. The pressure of the debris pinned him in place, crushing his body and immediately immobilizing any attempt at self-rescue. The relentless weight and tumbling motion of the avalanche ensured that even a brief struggle would be futile, turning a single misstep into a fatal event within moments. Sherpa guides immediately activated emergency protocols, transmitting distress signals to base camp and nearby teams. Despite rapid deployment, reaching Grace's location was dangerous due to unstable terrain and ongoing avalanche risk. Rescuers arrived approximately 40 minutes later, locating him under deep, consolidated snow. Medical assessment confirmed death had occurred within minutes of burial, primarily from asphyxiation, with blunt force trauma from debris contributing. Electronic beacon data indicated Grace had been immobilized immediately, consistent with the devastating forces involved. Post-incident analysis concluded that Grace's reliance on statistical models over real-time judgment proved fatal. Financial algorithms could not account for the chaotic, unpredictable avalanche hazards of the Western CWM, despite access to warnings and environmental data, his confidence in historical probabilities led him to discount expert advice. News emphasized his financial achievements, while the mountaineering community recognized his death as a cautionary tale. Analytical brilliance, when misapplied to dynamic natural hazards, can become deadly. It was May 8, 2016. On Everest's South Col route, Dr. Patricia Morehouse showed severe altitude sickness, but refused to descend, demanding her guides continue the summit push. Temperatures were well below freezing. Winds swept the ridge, and oxygen was severely limited, making even small mistakes potentially fatal. Dr. Patricia Morehouse, 46, was the CEO of a biotech company and had publicly stated her goal of becoming the first pharmaceutical CEO to summit Everest. Her high-altitude experience consisted only of weekend hikes, yet she had invested in a premium expedition. Morehouse's medical degree led her to dismiss guide recommendations, believing her training in conventional medicine allowed her to self-assess altitude sickness. This overconfidence, combined with zero experience at extreme altitude, created a high-risk situation. Her decision-making prioritized personal achievement and publicity over safety, ignoring protocols designed to prevent fatal outcomes in the death zone. The South Col route presents extreme physiological challenges, even for acclimatized climbers. At this altitude, oxygen levels are greatly reduced, dehydration accelerates, and blood chemistry can become dangerous within hours. Early symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema include headache, nausea, and loss of coordination, which can progress to confusion, coma, and death if untreated. Morehouse exhibited these warning signs at Camp 3, including severe headaches, nausea, and impaired balance. Guides recommended immediate descent, but she refused, claiming her medical training gave her authority over professional mountaineering advice. Despite warnings, Morehouse continued upward. Her neurological condition worsened rapidly, with increasing confusion, slurred speech, and loss of coordination. She stumbled repeatedly over uneven snow and ice, and her refusal to attach to safety ropes left her fully exposed on steep sections of the route. Guides attempted to redirect her multiple times, but she ignored instructions, moving toward areas with severe exposure. The combination of extreme altitude, low oxygens, and physical exhaustion magnified the effects of cerebral edema, reducing her ability to recognize danger. At one point, near the south summit approach, Morehouse moved toward a cliff edge with a steep drop. A guide intervened, restraining her just feet from the precipice and preventing an immediate fall. The physical struggle triggered a violent seizure as swelling in her brain increased intracranial pressure. During the seizure, her limbs flailed uncontrollably and she became unresponsive to verbal commands. Guides noted that she was partially disoriented, even when briefly conscious, unable to maintain balance, and exhibiting erratic behavior consistent with severe, high-altitude cerebral edema. The seizure lasted several minutes, during which her brain continued to swell within the confined skull, compressing brain tissue against the bone. This led to rapid onset of coma, and her breathing became irregular as brainstem function deteriorated. Attempts by guides to stabilize her were limited by the steep, exposed terrain and extreme environmental conditions. Even after she lost consciousness, she remained exposed to severe cold and low oxygen, further compounding the physiological damage. Respiratory arrest followed shortly thereafter, leaving her unresponsive despite continued rescue efforts. Guides initiated emergency descent procedures, but the damage was irreversible. Radio calls were made to request helicopter evacuation, though aircraft could only reach lower camps due to terrain and weather restrictions. Ground rescue teams reached Morehouse several hours later and confirmed her death from respiratory failure related to brain stem compression. Body evacuation to Kathmandu occurred through combined helicopter and ground transport. The coroner's report identified high-altitude cerebral edema with brain herniation as the primary condition, noting respiratory failure from brainstem compression as the cause of death. Contributing factors included rapid ascent without adequate acclimatization and refusal to descend despite clear medical indicators. The incident has since been used in high-altitude medicine training programs to demonstrate that conventional medical knowledge does not replace specialized expertise in extreme environments. It was May 19, 2016. Weather conditions on Mount Everest were deteriorating after a brief summit window had closed the previous day. Other teams were still high on the mountain, racing against worsening conditions. Felicity Whitmore was 46 from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she ran an event planning company built on rigid schedules. Before leaving for Nepal, she created a comprehensive spreadsheet detailing every day of the expedition, specific time blocks for each activity, exact dates for each camp, the precise day she would summit. The guide explained that Everest doesn't follow schedules. Weather and conditions dictate timing. Felicity responded that proper planning prevents problems. The expedition deviated from her schedule almost immediately. Weather delays put them 2 days behind. Felicity became visibly stressed. During acclimatization, her inflexibility created constant friction. When the guide recommended extra rest due to high winds, Felicity refused, stating rest was scheduled for the following day. By mid-May, her schedule had become disconnected from reality. On May 17th, Felicity's team moved to Camp 3. The plan was to move to Camp 4 on May 18th, then attempt the summit that night. At Camp 3, the guide emphasized a turnaround time of 1 p.m. on May 19th, regardless of position. Felicity argued that 1 p.m. was too early. The guide stated firmly that clients who didn't agree would not be permitted to attempt the summit. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 18th. Felicity arrived at 3 p.m., exhausted. Oxygen saturation 61%. The guide told her to rest before the summit push at 10 p.m. Felicity spent the rest period checking gear and reviewing her timeline. She barely rested. The summit push began at 10 p.m. Conditions were marginal. Higher winds than forecasted. Temperature minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Felicity climbed aggressively, pushing past other climbers. The guide repeatedly told her to maintain steady pace. Felicity ignored him. By midnight, she was ahead of her group. At 1 a.m., her pace began to slow. They reached the balcony at 27,500 feet around 4 a.m. Behind her calculated pace, she became visibly agitated. The climb to the south summit was brutal. Winds increased to 40 to 50 miles per hour. Wind chill approaching minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they reached the south summit at 28,700 feet, around 7:30 a.m., she was completely exhausted. She collapsed in the snow, unable to stand. The guide assessed her condition, coherent but extremely fatigued. Oxygen saturation 56%, movement slow and uncoordinated. He decided they would not continue. They would descend. Felicity refused. The guide explained she was exhausted, weather was deteriorating, and they needed to descend. Felicity checked her watch. Only 7:30 a.m. They had until 1 p.m. The guide explained the turnaround time was for being back at this position and descending, not for reaching the summit. The guide stated firmly they were descending. Felicity refused to move. After 10 minutes, the guide told her he was descending with or without her. Felicity stated she was continuing. The guide radioed base camp. They advised him to descend. He made one final attempt. She refused. He began descending around 7:50 a.m. Felicity rested 20 minutes, then climbed toward the summit at extremely slow pace. At 9:30 a.m., she reached the Hillary step, taking 45 minutes to ascend it. The final 200 feet took another 45 minutes. She reached the summit around 11 a.m., alone. She sat down, too exhausted to stand, and remained 15 minutes before descending. The descent was catastrophic. By the time she descended the Hillary step around 12:30 p.m., she'd been moving for 13 and a half hours. Her pace slowed to 50 feet every 10 minutes. At 1 p.m., the turnaround time, she was still at 28,600 feet. She sat down, unable to continue. She tried to radio but couldn't operate it. Cognitive function severely impaired. At 1:30 p.m., weather deteriorated sharply. Wind increased to 60+ miles per hour. Visibility dropped. Snow fell. At 2 p.m., climbers found Felicity sitting unresponsive. She was conscious but severely hypothermic and unable to move. They radioed base camp. Base camp told them to do what they could, then descend. The climbers gave her an oxygen bottle at maximum flow and tried setting up shelter, but wind was too strong. After 30 minutes, they descended at 2:45 p.m. No one else passed her position. At some point during the afternoon or evening, Felicity Whitmore died from hypothermia, exhaustion, and hypoxia. Her body was found May 21st, frozen solid, where the climbers had left her. The oxygen bottle was empty. Official cause of death was exposure and hypothermia with contributing factors of exhaustion and hypoxia. The investigation noted she'd summited more than 3 hours after her guide recommended turning back and been caught by forecasted deteriorating weather. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.